Welcome to Fosu Inspired. Kindly subscribe and like our YouTube videos. Today we come to the part 4 of Introduction to Political Economy of Africa since Independence. And then we decide to look at theories or theoretical approach to Africa's development. All these theories that today I'll be going with you are full theories that on its own can be treated as a topic in itself, but we'll be touching on some basis of it to be able to help you theorize and begin to understand what the developmental trajectory of Africa is, or what, as an aspiring academician or as a scholar, you use in justifying some of the views and perspective you think actually explains the lens in which you see Africa's development from. So, as I've said that this particular topic or this slide is very important because development studies in Africa's political economy, the theories is what is going to help you explain why Africa has developed the way it is, why underdevelopment persists in some places. It will give you that enlightenment to know what kind of policies is different, or what kind of policy do other scholars also think could change the situation in Africa. So, in other words, this particular slide is not just about memorizing names of theorists or theories or those who propound it. No, it is about understanding how different people explain Africa's development what challenges, and possibly some theories blame what internal problem, some blame global exploitation, some focus on the state, some focus on what on knowledge and colonial legacy, and some argue that Africa must build from its own realities. So we are going through this particular slide, and I want you to keep asking one question: what does each theory explain well, and what does it fail to explain? The learning goal for this particular session is that at the end, I want you to be able to basically do several things. And some of these things I would want you to be able to, at the end of this session, is that you should understand the main ideas behind major theories of Africa. You should be able, secondly, you should be able to compare them because theories often would disagree with one another. You may have one also saying this, another agreeing here or disagreeing here. And finally, you should be able to use them in essay writing, not just defining them. And that means that when you leave this particular session, you should not only be able to say that modernization theory or dependency theory is, you should be able to say which one better explains a country like Ghana, Nigeria, Rwanda, Zambia, and why. That is the standard we want, and the understanding and then comparison and application I would want you to leave this session with. Now, why theory matters. So before we look at the theory one after the other, we first ask ourselves why theory do matter, right? Because theory matter because facts by itself do not explain everything. We may know that a country is poor, heavily indebted, resource rich, or politically unstable, but theories will help us ask deeper questions. Why is it so? What is the cause, or what is causing it? Who benefits if this country is at war? If this country is unstable, who benefits? So with theory, you'll be able to understand this. Well, you take a country like DRC Congo, as it experienced some of these war with the M23 rebels. You ask yourself, when these battles are happening or this instability happens in DR Congo, who is benefiting? That's what theory will help us understand. And it gives us that understanding that what should be done different. So with theory, we're able to get the terms of what is causing it, who benefits, and what should be done differently. So in Africa's development, theories matter even more because they are what competing with explanation. But one scholar may say Africa is underdeveloped because it did not modernize properly, right? Another may say that Africa is undeveloped because European and global capitalist structure is the cause of that. Another may say that the problem is weak war state. Another may say that the problem is that the very idea of development has been defined through what an Eurocentric lens. So theory matters because they shape what diagnosis, and these diagnoses shape what policies. So if you think Africa's problem is too much state control, you will recommend what privatization. If you think the problem is exploitative of global trade or Africa is being exploited, you will recommend what protection or delinking from that particular system. If you think the problem is weak institution, you recommend state building. That is why this topic is not abstract. It is directly tied to what real political and economic choices. From the lens and perspective you are seeing Africa's problem for. So let's begin with modernization theory. Modernization theory argues that development is a linear process from a traditional society to a modern society. So, in simple terms, it says that society moves step by step from being rural, traditional, and less industrialized towards becoming urban, industrial, educated, technologically advanced, and economically modern. So, according to this particular theory, Africa should develop by adapting Western institutions, Western markets, the likes of the privatization, Western institutions, the ideas of democracy, Western values. That the theory highlights that industrialization, urbanization, mass education, and technology transfer as the main drivers of of development. So its policy advice is basically this, that follow the Western pattern, follow the Western pattern, and you'll be able to advance and be modernized. So now, why was this theory influential? It was because it became a very powerful theory in the post World War II era, especially during decolonization, where Western governments and international institutions liked it because it presented development as a technical and universal process. It struggled. It suggested that poor countries could become developed by following the same route taken by Europeans and North American. So to break this down, what it's saying is that if modernization theory looks or looked at an African country, they would probably ask questions like, is it industrializing? Are more people going to school? Are cities growing? Is technology spreading? Are traditional beliefs giving way to modern bureaucratic institutions? So the strength of this theory is that it draws attention to real things that matters: education, infrastructure, industries, and technology. But as we will see next, it has weaknesses. which are also what serious, and we're going to look at that. So basically, this is the core idea of what of modernization what theory, that you follow us in terms of how we've done our things, which you move from the rural, traditional, less industrialized towards what an urban, industrialized, educated, or technological what advanced and economically what modern society or system. Then every theory has criticisms, more like disagreements, more like other scholars who also disagree with these theories and challenge some of the things that the theories says. So the first major criticism is that it ignores colonial history. They say that it's often what treats Africa as if it's a simple or like Africa simply just began in the 1960s, as if colonization did not what violently what reshape Africa's economy, the Africa's politics and society. So what the criticism over here is that you talk about like Africa should model around this, and you're forgetting that you were here. So then, what prevented you from industrializing Africa? What prevented you from helping Africa get to that things you were talking about? Even if that is so, that is some of the critiques against the modernization theory. And the issue why is that they say that we know that colonial rule extracted resources, distorted boundaries, and then damaged what institution. So Africa did not start from a neutral position. That is what we mean by ignores colonial what history, as in their part in what the problem is now. And then the second criticism is that it assumes that Western superiority assumes what a Western was superiority, that it often presents Africa's cultures and institutions as what obsolete, that needs to be replaced rather than what resources that can also what support development. And this is more like a serious weakness because it makes Western history seem universal and African history seem what backward. And the fact that something may have worked in maybe in Germany doesn't mean doing the same thing in Ghana or in Kenya will work. No, it doesn't work that way. And thirdly, it overlooks power and class. The third one, which is overlooking power and class, that scholars like Claudia Aki and other argues that development is not just about a society being traditional or modern, but it is also about state power, class interest, and global inequalities. Because they say that the modernization theory overlooks power and class, which they feel has a role to play. And finally, its empirical record is weak in the sense that many countries adapted modernization policies. They borrowed Western institutions, they expanded education, and still remained poor or unequal. So copying the West did not automatically bring development. So what we are saying is that modernization theory is useful because it reminds us that education, industry, and technology matters. But it is what weak because it ignores history, power, and unequal global structures. Now to our second theory, which is dependency theory. Dependency theory emerged partly as a reaction against modernization theory. I would say basically to challenge the modernization theory. Because it argues that Africa is not under development because it failed to copy the West. They are saying that Africa is not underdeveloped because it failed to copy the West. Think about that. But rather, Africa is what underdeveloped because it has been incorporated into a global capitalist system in a dependent and exploitative way. So they are saying that Africa is what you see because Africa has been seen as a prey where the global system is preying upon it by exploiting it. So, in other words, development and non-development are connected. So, they are saying that Europe and other wealthy countries develop partly through the exploitation of Africa and Latin America and Asia. That the resources that they are exporting from these countries, they are taking from these countries, is the reason why they are where they are. So, Africa's poverty is not simple, or it's not simply a natural backwardness, but it is a historical produce, or historically engineered. And this one is a major shift in thinking, because modernization theory says that developed like the West, while dependency says that wait, the West developed partly by exploiting others. So it is so simply copying the West does not solve the problem. So the theory's main argument is that Africa occupies a dependent position in the world economy, and it's mainly exports raw materials and import finished goods, technology and capital. So they are saying that this unequal exchange keeps Africa weak and dependent, and that is why Africa is where it is. And two thinkers that are around this, you find Andrew Gunda Frank, Wateroni, and the other scholars, a lot of scholars who are about. So Wateroni, in as how Europe underdeveloped Africa, argues that Europe did not simply fail to develop Africa. It actually underdeveloped Africa through slavery, colonialism, and economic domination. So I repeat again, he argues and he says that Europe failed to develop Africa, but it's actually underdeveloped Africa that was intentional, that they did that through slavery, colonialism, and economic dominance. Also, Samira Amin, an Egyptian writer, he argued that the paradigm of capitalism locked countries like those in Africa into into a chamber of subordination, which was more like we played a role in that global capitalism for them and became subordinates, where we're being going to be a resource of being extracted from Africa or these places. So for him, the policy prescription of dependency theory included nationalizing key industries. When I say policy prescription, as in what was prescribed or advanced by them could actually help deal with this challenge they spotted or spoken about, is that it's about dealing with which include which include nationalizing keyword industries, like taking over their gold sites, taking over their diamond site, taking over their own resources, and promoting regional integration, that they'll be able to trade among themselves within Africa itself. The likes of Ghana and Nigeria being able to trade, the likes of Ghana and Burkina Faso, like Cote d'Ivoire, being able to trade. That is what they are talking about. That could be that policy prescription that could help Africa. And that's what they mean by regional integration. And try to delink from exploitative global markets. So the theory says that Africa should reduce dependency on external control and build stronger internal and regional economic system. And over here, a practical example will be if a country like Ghana export cocoa beans cheaply and then import expensive chocolate. The dependency theory says that that country remains trapped in a subordinate position. So the real development will be that it would be involved in processing and adding value to that cocoa beans locally, and not just exporting that raw beans out of Ghana. So the theory is what is powerful because it forces you to understand that under development, it forces you to understand or see from the perspective that under development, for whom and who benefits from the current system. Every theory has its own criticisms against it, and dependency theory is no different. So dependency theory shows or is excellent at showing how global exploitation matters, but weaker at explaining why countries facing similar external pressures, one way or the other, have found it way to succeed. That why some perform better than others, while the likes of Botswana do relatively better than some other African countries. And then some of these criticisms is that underestimate Africa's agencies. And when we say underestimate Africa's agency, what we are saying is that African countries have it can make it look or seem as if African countries have no agencies at all, as if everything is controlled by the external system. But we know that domestic politics, leadership, corruption, um, policy choices, and institution also matters, and they also play a role. And they have also contributed to some of the failures that persist. That is a criticism against this theory. Another criticism is that it does not explain the variation. So if all countries are trapped in the same way as is being said, why do some perform better than others? Why did the likes of, as I said, Botswana do relatively better than some other African countries? That is some of the criticisms against dependency theory. And then sometimes criticized for being too focused on external blames and not paying enough attention to internal class alliance or internal governance failures. So a balanced way for you to see is that dependency theory is excellent at showing how global exploitation matters, but weaker at explaining why countries facing similar external pressures can still perform differently. We move to the world system theory, which is associated with Immanuel Wallerstein, more like a proponent of the world system theory. So this theory says the world is in one capitalist system. So instead of treating each country separately, it says we should look at the world from a global structure. So that in the sense that the system is divided into three zones: core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral. That Africa is located in the peripheral, meaning it mainly supplies raw materials and has weak bargaining power. So the key difference here is that the unit of analysis, that's the key difference. The world system theory says we should not focus only on the nation state, but we should focus on the world system itself, the world system itself. That the larger historical global economy, how it has been designed and how it has been structured. And this is you are looking at it from the prism of time and doing a historical analysis, taking it from the Enlightenment state, the Renaissance to now, makes you understand that there's been a system that has been perpetuated or designed over time. That is what the world system theory gives us the understanding in this particular theory, that different powers dominate at different time. So at a point, Britain was one of the world dominated um, powers, more like the world hegemony. Then the US state, and now some people may say that China may be becoming the center of the new power. That is currently the US is still kind of the world hegemony, but in that particular sense. So movement between this zone is what is possible. As in, when I say movement between this zone, as in what you see over here is that this peripheral, semi-peripheral, and the core peripheral are seen over here. there's a movement between this that can be possible. You can find countries moving from one zone to the other. And this zone you are seeing here is that this has been a structure that has been done from time immemorial, from like history, for looking at it from the history of time. It has been a system that has been engineered down. So when you find the likes of Ghana, Haiti, Afghanistan, Niger, Burkina Faso are peripheral, don't think it's just that. It is being structured from history. When the when when you had people from the west coming for this evangelism, discover came to Africa, saw a different continent available, build a system where they were extracting their resources. So it has been something that has been designed for a long time. So the same peripheral countries like the likes of Brazil, the likes of South India, and other countries over here, Chile, and then the core are the likes of the US, UK, Germany, Japan, as these are the core countries. So what I was saying earlier was that Britain was once dominant, the US took over, and now some people think that China is becoming the center of a new way. So as I was saying, movement between this zone is what the zone I've just spoken about or described over here is possible. And that this theory is what is useful for helping us understand the historical and global pattern that was created already. So it explains why a country may struggle, not just because of domestic failures, but because of its structural place in the global economy, how the global system has been structured, and where the country has been placed. And this is historical in nature. It's a system that has been put in place for a long time. So the core ones are the ones who are basically extracting resources from the peripheral. So the peripheral are producers of raw materials. They export raw materials. This and they have the cheap labor. But some peripheral in the middle, they also export raw materials, all right, but they have a bit of technology in the mix of all this. Whilst the core is driven by science and fully science and technology in that regard. So criticisms against the world system theory is that the world system theory categories can be too rigid. So, for example, China was once often treated as as sim peripheral, but now it challenged the core power in major ways, which is the United States. So, reality does not always fit neatly into the box. These are some of the critiques that are being leveled against the world system theory. Another critique is that it can be economically economic reductionism. So it focuses heavily on economic position and not enough on politics. So it's saying it's so bent on economy, but forgetting the politics of it, the culture, the ideology, and the social movement. This is another criticism against the world system theory. And the third one is that it underplays internal factors that about of governance, education, institutions, and domestic policy that they still matters. So two countries can both be peripheral, but still differ significantly in terms of outcome. And finally, because it is broad and historical, it can be hard to use for precise prediction. So it is strong as a bigger picture to interpret truths than as a practical forecasting model. So what I want to say is that war system theory is very useful for seeing Africa within the global capitalism, how Africa has been positioned, looking at it from history, how it has been engineered, and then Africa has been fixed somewhere, right? But but it should also not make us forget domestic realities. That's what I mean in terms of the critiques also. Now we move to neoliberal theory. And neoliberalism argues that free markets not states, as in you don't see state interventions, or the state should be at the back seat, drive efficiency or efficient what development. So neoliberalism says that state intervention often would create what distortion, inefficiency, and corruption and wastage in the system. So its main policy includes that you should have trade liberalization, open your market, allow people to be able to trade freely. Don't use things like quota, tariffs, bans to restrict trade with yourself. Privatizations of what of state enterprises. The state should not get involved in the market. So if the state is owning institutions, they should what they are owning their companies. They should what privatize them. They should give it to what private sector, or offload it toward the private sector. And deregulation and fiscal what discipline. So in Africa, these ideas were applied more visibly through structural adjustment program, which we talk about also later as we carry on, right? Which is the SOP, right? Which was promoted by the World Bank and the IMF during the 80s and the 90s. The basic message was that get prices what right, shrink the state, remove control, and attract what investment. So the theory believes that governments stop interfering too much and allow the market to allocate resources more effectively and grow without with its own flow. So this theory is important historically because many African countries were pushed to adopt this policy. So it is not just a theory that we are just pondering or talking about in terms of abstract. No, it is directly what shaped. It has directly what shaped budgets in Africa. It has shaped trade system in Africa. It has shaped public employment and welfare what policies across what the continent. So in simple terms, what I'm trying to say that if dependency theory says that Africa suffers too much external control, neoliberal theory or neoliberalism often says that Africa suffers from too much internal state control. So they are saying that Africa is where maybe because there's too much state control. That is what the main idea of what neoliberalism, where they are pushing privatization. They are proving the fact that the state should take a back bench from the economy and allow the economy itself to do. They should also engage in what fiscal discipline. So all these are some of the points. Trade liberalization are some of the things that what neoliberalism would promulgates in terms of what its theory. As we also say, every theory has a criticism or has more like what a weakness. So the first criticism I want to talk about neoliberalism is that social cost. They prescribe cut toward healthcare, education, subsidy, often which hurt the poor and even make people more poorer. Because even in a microeconomic world, even if a microeconomic indicator improves, the issue over here is that everyday life could become much more harder for the ordinary citizen. Because some people is this kind of subsidy and some of these things that seeks to help them alleviate what their poverty or help them make their life more better. So it actually plunged more people into what people are saying, it actually plunged more people into what poverty. That's the social cost of it. A second of criticism against neoliberal reforms is that neoliberal reforms often what created new forms of what dependency. That African markets were open to foreign capital and what imports, but local industries were often too weak to compete. But even though there was this issue of liberalism, let's open our markets, the likes of bigger companies bringing their vehicles, their things in your countries, we did not have the capacity to challenge the likes of the Volkswagens, the BMWs. No. So it created another what problem and weakened what the local what industry, or they were not able to compete. So instead of producing strong domestic economy, some reforms would deepen what our vulnerability. And thirdly, it ignored what power imbalances. because free trade are not really free when the country negotiating from an unequal position. When the country who is negotiating with you basically has experience in what industrialization, has experience in production, and you're now about to start, it is not even. So a weak African economy opening itself to a powerful global market is not the same as what equal competition. And the fourth we'll talk about over years was that it was a mixed resource. Because in some places there was inflation control or fiscal adjustment, but there was also what rising inequality, unemployment, and what and poverty was also what on the high. Because in Ghana alone, in terms of its economic recovery program from the IMF under this, they actually what suffered had 200,000 public job what losses. So these are some of the criticisms against what neoliberal theory or liberalism. And the final one is it often treats Africa as if it was one place, one size fits all what reforms. But ignore the local context, the history, the institution, and political realities. In the sense that if this works for maybe Kenya, that means it works for Ghana, it works in Angola. No, it doesn't work that way because these are different African what countries which have different cultural or historical or institutional what differences. So treating Africa as one size fits all was one criticism that was against a neoliberal what, theory in terms of political what, economy. So neoliberalism promised efficiency, but in many African contexts, it brought painful social consequences, and it did not what deliver what the broader based transformation what it promised. Moving to developmental states approach, this theory argues that a strong, capable state can guide markets towards industrialization. So, unlike neoliberalism, it does not say that the state should withdraw. It says that the state should intervene strategically in the market, in how things are going. So the main two include that industrial policies, targeted subsidy and credit, infrastructure investment, and protection of what infant industries by using the likes of tariffs and quota to help infant industry grow. Don't open the market that much for no. So protect infant industry so that they'll be able to what, get to a stage where they'll be able to compete on the global stage. So this particular model is inspired by the East Asian target, especially the likes of South Korea, Taiwan, and was Singapore. So in Africa's context, thinkers like Makandowa argues that Africa should not simply abandon the state. Instead, it should build what a capable state that can contribute or coordinate development and transform the economy. So this theory is attractive because it combines realism and ambition. It accepts that the markets matter, but it says that market alone does not create industrial transformation, that the state has to guide, discipline, and support economic change. An example is this: if a country wants to develop a local textiles or manufacturing what industry, it may need what temporary what protection. What I mean, it may need temporary protection in the sense that having to allow other people or the other people who export textiles that are cheaper, they may not be able to compete. So you may give it protection, give it tax holidays to be able to get that room to be able to produce. So you empower that local what textiles or manufacturing industry. It may need what temporary what protection, as I said, infrastructure, credits, monies to be able to help them even do more, and state planning. Not just open what competition from day one. No, this is what developmental state approach what talks about. So the first criticism is that Developmental states would require stronger state capacity, and the many African states lack the bureaucratic autonomy. What they're trying to say is that as it talks about capacity, many African states does not maybe allow the room for bureaucrats to operate independently. And then in terms of maybe appointment may not be based on merit. So in terms of meritocracy may be a problem. And discipline that the Western what Asian state would had. Those are the critics, what they say. That if you try to say that let's try and adopt the different state model, that Africa has that capacity to do that. That is what they are saying. It doesn't mean I agree. Second, one that we'll talk about that there is a risk of elite capture. So if the state is powerful but not accountable, a state-led development can become what can lead to corruption and favoritism rather than what productive or transformation. That's another criticism. A third criticism is that there are fiscal what constraints that many African states have weak tax base and cannot easily what finance that large scale what industrial policies. That they may not have the money to be able to what fund those development or investment we're asking government to do. And then fourth, political instability undermines long-term planning. That when it comes to developmental states, it's about long-term planning. And developmental state requires what? The form of continuity. So if there is frequent government change, coup d'etats, or unstable what uh, coercion, it makes long-term planning work. And then finally, success stories are relatively few or are not many. So maybe when it comes to developmental state models, some of the examples you can start, you can quote is the likes of Rwanda and Botswana, which are often cited. But scaling that model across the continent is going to be difficult. So the balance or the issue of this particular theory is that it is hopeful and practical, but it depends heavily on having a capacity, discipline, and developmental state, which is not what easy what to build. So going back to not the criticisms, but back to our point is that developmental state is a beautiful idea, but it will require that these African states who want to approach that would have to build a capacity, strong bureaucracy, be able to widen its tax nest, to be able to apply developmental state model to achieve success that Asian targets also did achieve with this. It's just a full theory on its own. But for the purpose of this particular course, I said we are just touching on it by giving you snippets and a fair idea about what it means in terms of political economy and where it is situated in political economy. But it's a full theory on its own. So postcolonial theory argues that colonialism effect goes beyond economics. That colonialism basically shaped what power, knowledge, culture, and identity. That even after formal independence, development would discourage or was often what discouraged and then seen in the lives of or remains of what European centric or European centrism. And you've had thinkers that are like Franz Fanon, Achimbembe, and Walter Ronnie. So Fanon's focus was on decolonization, which you find Franz Fanon's video on our YouTube channel, an amazing video, and then a great person, and also know about the black skin, white marks, the wretched of the earth. You can read that of listen to that video of Franz Fanon. So Fanon focused on decolonization, violence, and what psychological what effect of what colonial what domination. And Machim Bembe as what exploited or exposed that post-colonial power and the ideas that was linked to what nuclear politics, which you find that also on the YouTube channel. And Ronnie links these two what concept to what the material of what underdevelopment. So what I want you to put in mind that this particular theory asks questions that the earlier theories do not ask strongly enough. Who defines development? Why are African institutions judged by Western standard? Why is Africa so often represented as backward, primitive, or broken? So its focus area includes colonial world boundaries, knowledge systems, that what we are learning is the one that represent the true African identity, the colonial boundaries, and the representation. So this means that the theory is not only asking how Africa can grow economically, it's also what asking how colonial what categories continue to shape the way Africa what is seen and governed. Next slide. We are going deeper into what representation, and this is especially important for you to understand, because you are able to see that there's this image and narrative that has been created every day that you come across. So in this particular slide, you will know that the global media often represent Africa using stereotypes such as primitive, childlike, irrational, backward, and with images of what property, poverty, disaster, and world domination coverage, as if there's no war that's ever happened what in European countries. When Europe had its tribal war, First World War, they called it First World War. That war had nothing to do with Africa. It had nothing to do with some parts of the world, but they said it was the First World War. They branded it in a way that made it look like it's the whole world that is fighting it. But they paint a history of Africa as if it's a place where when you go, it's just war all over plagued Africa. There isn't peace. No, that's what they paint it to look like. They forget the fact that this is an Africa where the pyramid of wonders was done. Where when you go to Ethiopia, the wonders of architecture is still in Ethiopia. The wonders of leadership by the likes of the Mansa Musa of Mali, it is still there. That Africa. And the post-colonial response is that these representations are not what harmless. They shape policy, investment decisions, and public what opinion. They has this kind of harm that because it's one thing that shapes what comes around or what happens. They justify what intervention. They erase Africa's innovation and what complexity and agencies, as if Africa has nothing and we are not doing anything here. Because the issue is that if Africa is constantly what presented as what as a continent of what helpless victims, then outsiders begin to see Africa as an object, something to manage, rather than as a place of what thinkers, creators, or institutions and political actors. And then know that development is not only about rules and GDP, it's also about who has the power to define reality. Because your reality gives you confidence. So criticisms also about post-colonial. One criticism is that it can be too abstract, that is often focused on discourse, language, and representation, but it may not give clearer what policy what solution. There's some criticisms against what against post-colonial theory. Another criticism is that it can be what weak on economics. That critics argue that it is so focused only on identity and discourse, and it may neglect other issues like trade, class, debt, labor, and industrialization. And also, another third criticism is that it risks cultural what essentialism. Sometimes people speak of Africa's culture as if it is one pure thing, but Africa's societies are all diverse, unequal, and what and internally what contested. So some of these are all criticisms that are level against post-colonial. What I'm saying that post-colonial theory gives us a powerful insight into power and knowledge, but uh, it often shows that it doesn't have that combination with political analysis, economic analysis, as is sometimes being criticized by other scholars that it is solely focused on discourse and other issues of knowledge and not more so on the economic analysis part of it. Moving to endogenous knowledge or African-centered development. So um, this is that this approach or this theory argues that development must come from within African society. That it says that it says that external blueprints, especially the one-size-fits-all modernization or neoliberal models, often what ignores local what knowledge or local conditions and Africa's priority. So its key what principles are valuing local what knowledge, culture, and community what participation, and then rejecting that one size fits all approach that we're going to use one thing that worked here, so we're going to use for everybody. No, and then emphasizing what sustainability and what inclusive what growth. So this particular theory where you have great thinkers like Onovo and Pauline Otunji, um, looking at this from this thinkers perspective and more, this particular theory is attractive because it restores Africa's agencies. So it says that Africa should not simply be what a testing ground for imported policy model, that it should what think from its own realities, its own history, and what institutional what need. So the African should look inward, look for solutions that are built domestically that could help it solve its own issues. That is where the African centered what development what idea or this theory looks at. Now let's look at also the criticisms against um, this particular theory we spoke about. That one criticism over here is that the risk of isolation, that if a country rejects all external ideas, it may cut itself from useful what learning, finance, and technology transfer. And another is that internal what heredity what also matters. The African culture is not uniform, and some local what practice may marginalize women, minority, or young people. So local knowledge should not be romanticized in an authoritative what way, or more like an automatic, like it's automatic in that nature. No. And the third criticism is that even endogenous what development still needs what resources. So capital offering comes partly from outside. So the question is not whether to engage the world, but how to engage it better, or how to get better terms in terms of your engagement. So the best way to see is that African centered development is valuable because it restores agency and context, but it must still what avoid isolationism or isolation, and must still face what internal what inequality what honestly. So we've basically gone through most of these particular what theories, and these are not the only theories that explains um, Africa's development. No, or in relation to political economy. But these are some of the few theories we basically what picked about in terms of this particular what course that we are discussing. In terms of these theories, you can ponder over this particular table very well, which basically gives you modernization, the main cause of underdevelopment that modernization says, that or the theories are saying, the policy prescription that these theories are giving out. When I say policy prescription, what they seek that it should be done so that if there's a problem, that problem will fix. And the criticism that are being leveled against them is not, some of the criticisms are there. You're not going to agree with them. You may disagree with them. It is normal. It is solely okay that you may disagree with some of the criticisms that are leveled here, which I also disagree with some of the criticisms myself. That is the beauty of what of academia. So this slide is more important for your revision and an essay preparation. It is to help you to compare the theories, the main courses, of underdevelopment, the policy prescription, and the key criticisms, as I said. So what I've done over here is that you're able to have a view that modernization blames what traditional culture and institution. Then dependency what blames exploitative global what relationship. War system theory blames Africa's what position in the world economy. Neoliberalism blame what distortion. Developmental state theory blames what weaker or capacity capable what captured state, and post-colonial theory blames colonial power and Eurocentric what knowledge, and the endogenous what approach also would blame what external model and dysfunctional what internal what system. So this table basically helps you to be able to understand them and avoid confusion and put each one within the right perspective or the right what lane in terms of its criticism, its main cause, and policy what prescription. So it also shows you that the theories are what are competing what lens, or gives you that competing lens of this particular theories, and they are also not saying exactly the same thing. So in an essay, you should not mix them what up. You should be careful to understand what each particular theory's main causes, policy prescription, and then what key criticisms what are. This particular one for a while, how you can use theories in an essay writing. So when you use a theory in an essay, first state the theory clearly, define its core argument in a simple or accurate manner that you can remember. Secondly, apply it to a case, such as maybe, for example, you can say, oh, Ghana, if you want to apply by Ghana, Nigeria, Rwanda, or another African country, any other African country you think you'd want to use for or your case study or some example. And third, show that it explains or show what it explains well and be specific about it. And the fourth one is note what it misses. What does it miss? And finally, you can combine theories when it is useful. And this is very important for you in terms of writing. And then one thing I'll say that do not just write definitions. Do not just write definitions. What you should do is that use theories as analytical tools. And the question is, how do I use theories as an analytical tool? For example, you might say dependency theory explains Ghana's historical role as a raw material exporter, but it does not fully what explain domestic government failures. Or you may say developmental state theory helps explain Rwanda's what strategic what policy choices, but it may underplay political what constraints or lack of what replicability what elsewhere. So the goal is not to memorize a theory word for word. The goal is to use it what intellectually, right? So you can do this way and make it easy for you in terms of what you're writing. Now, reflection question, as in which theory takes colonial history serious? Which theory stresses Africa's agency? Which theory focus on global versus domestic factors? And which theory are more optimistic and pessimistic? These are very good reflection questions because it makes you see this just beyond the simple lines that are there. For example, modernization theory tends to ignore colonial history, while dependency and post-colonial theories take it serious. Neoliberalism focuses more on internal market reforms, whilst world system and dependency focus more on global structures. Endogenous development tries to give Africa more agencies, while dependency sometimes risks portraying Africa too much as a victim. So if you can reflect on this, it will be easy for you. It will be able for you to make a higher level of analysis. in terms of having to what explain or write or understand theories. What to bring this session to a close, this conclusion reminds us that theories are tools, not truth. Now I repeat, theories are tools, not truth. That is one of the most important lessons I want to take from this particular slide. That no single theory explains everything. Each theory helps us see something clearly, but each one also would leave something out. That is why this particular slide says that we should always ask, what does this explain? What does this explain? What does it misses? Or what does it miss? We should use evidence from Africa's history to test theories, rather than treating theories like unquestionable answers. So I leave you with this final line over here that says that the question is not which theory is right, but which theory together helps us understand Africa's past and builds its future. This is a nice way to leave you and leave you something to ponder over or think over. That theories should not imprison our thinking. They should shape it. So as you prepare for essays or you seek to understand this better, do not ask only what is the theory. Also ask, when is this theory useful? When does it fail? And what other theories do I need to complete that particular picture? Thank you. Think of cleaning services. Any cleaning service you think of, cleaning of glasses after a construction site has been done, or fumigation, you can reach out to DCK Cleaning Services and they'll be out to help you make it spotless, clean for you with no hassle. And as a man or as a lady, when you think of having to gift a man a dress, kaftan or any form of these dresses is the best gift to give out. As a man, to look slick and good, kaftan always looks good on you. You can reach out to GK by also checking out his social media handle to see some of the styles and give out your own styles. Or you can pick up on some of the styles that are available and it will be done for you in a very nice way to make you look nice and presentable anywhere you go. Thank you very much for listening to this particular or watching this particular video. Kindly subscribe, leave your comment, and like our YouTube videos. Thank you. And don't forget to watch the part 5 of this particular course.